Figuring out proper settings for TIG welding is extremely important. If this is something that is not set up properly, you are in for a frustrating time. All right, so sometimes when I post a picture on Instagram, one of the most common comments I get on all kinds of stuff is asking, what settings are you using? Now, answering this one's a little bit tricky because, to be completely honest, every machine that's used out there is gonna act differently in different scenarios. So a lot of the time, recommending settings which may work on my machine may not work well at all on someone else's machine. In my online TIG welding program, this is something we pay really close attention to. Not only learning what settings to use, but why we use them and what adjusting them is gonna do. So let's get into some of the most commonly asked questions about settings here. And if you're first getting going with TIG welding or first figuring out how to use a new machine, I got you covered. All right, the first setting we're gonna go over here is always most commonly amperage. Roughly translated, amperage usually just refers to the amount of heat that we're using on a workpiece. Okay, listen, trying to ballpark basic amperage settings, this is really difficult to do without knowing exact variables about the project that somebody's doing, and especially what the difference in machines is going to be between mine and theirs. For example, 150 amps, let's say welding an outside corner joint, this is going to perform completely different than trying to weld 150 amps doing a fillet weld in a vertical position, for example. We can use the same settings and get completely different results with this exercise. So while amperage is absolutely one of the most important things to have set correctly, trying to ballpark this one in the settings is kind of pointless. What I'm going to put on screen right now is a basic chart. This is a basic ballpark of recommended amperage. Now again, you can use this as a general ballpark to get going, but like I said, what position are you welding in? What size filler material are you using? There's a lot of variables that are going to change this up. Here is how I recommend finding out this really important setting for yourself. So if you are using a foot pedal for TIG welding, or if you're using a trigger that has a slider, basically any way that you can adjust the amperage while you're on the fly during a weld, essentially I kind of say it like this: you're all good. You can basically set your amperage for an amount that you know is going to be more than enough, essentially much more amperage than you actually need to do the weld that you're about to do. Keeping control of things with your foot pedal, making sure that things are not getting too hot as you're welding. Generally, you can usually keep things from getting out of control if you're paying attention. Now, when I say set your amperage a little bit too high, I'm talking within reason here. Basically a window between 20 and 30 amps or something like that. If you are ever in doubt, I usually find this is a good place to be. Like I said, as long as we're paying attention to details as we are welding, you can dictate how much of this amperage you are using with your foot pedal. This is a way to kind of keep things in control on the fly. A lot of the times when I'm doing demos for my channel here, I usually have more amperage set on the panel than I actually need. But again, I control it with my foot pedal. So sometimes if I really want to take some time to get perfectly set up with the exact amount of amperage I need, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to probably set about 20 to 30 amps below what I actually think I might need. So a ballpark, if I'm probably going to end up using about 160 amps for something, I'll usually start my machine off somewhere around 120 or 130 amps. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a test pass. And then when I'm finished that test pass, I'm going to have a look at how things went after. Typically, if we can see that the edges are not blending smoothly. Look at this example here. Do you see how the transition between the filler material and the base material? It looks really rough, right? It does not transition smooth between the two materials. When we really hit the sweet spot of our amperage setting, we want to see a transition like this, where it is nice and smooth between the filler material and the base material. Another thing you can look at is if your cleaning action is uneven or erratic looking. This usually indicates the same thing. We do not have enough amperage set. Now, what I like doing is finding my way towards the perfect amperage from here. I'll increase things by approximately 10 amps per increment. Readjust my machine, and then I'll run another pass. And again, if I see results that are not blending properly or quite as smooth as I want, we can go ahead and increase our amperage by another 10 amps or so. My last few adjustments in this setting will usually be between 5 amp intervals or so. So at this point, we're really taking the time to fine tune our results. If you're ever a little bit unsure or nervous about setting your amperage too high, I always recommend just start low and then work your way into it from there. Again, what we are looking for is smooth edges with our welding. We want consistent and uniform cleaning action. And obviously evidence that we are getting good heat input into the base material. Okay, this next recommendation for settings is very important. And actually, to be honest, it's something that's really important whether you're using a transformer type machine or an inverter type machine. And this setting is balance. So in case you don't know already, this is what an AC sine wave for welding aluminum looks like. So on one side we can see here we have DC positive, and on the other side we can see we have DC negative. So when TIG welding aluminum, our current is going to alternate between welding in DC positive and DC negative rapidly. So when adjusting our balance, what this is going to change is the amount of positive and negative we run on an AC cycle. So let's take a look at a pretty common setup for balance here. So sometimes when you're setting up a machine, you'll probably be somewhere in the ballpark of approximately 80% on the negative side and approximately 20% on the positive side. So the negative side of our AC cycle is going to do the majority of the actual welding, and essentially how our heat input really affects the base material. The positive side of the cycle is essentially going to be the cleaning side of our polarity. What this side is going to do is going to direct a little heat back at the tungsten. That's how we're going to keep the tungsten clean, as well as clear away oxide from the surface of the aluminum. And essentially working between these two polarities, this is how it is now possible to weld aluminum. Like I said, a general ballpark for balance is probably going to be somewhere around 80% negative. This is going to allow for good penetration and thoroughly directing our heat input into the base material. Now, the more you turn up your negative side, obviously the more you're going to get this effect into the base material. However, there will be a point of diminishing returns here. As we begin to run an insufficient amount of our positive side, what we're going to start to see is our weld is now going to start to look dull. It's going to lose the shiny reflective surface we want. So now essentially we are not getting enough of our positive side that we need. And when this happens, it's not going to provide as much cleaning action. It's not going to clear oxide off the weld. We're not going to get as clean as results. Now, you may think turning up your positive side is going to make things look all better, but we need to be careful about doing that as well. So as you begin to increase the amount of positive side of our balance, eventually you're going to reach a point where you start to see the tip of your tungsten lose its stability. When this happens, you're going to see the tip of your tungsten start to misshape slightly. Or in some cases, when things have gone way too far over to the positive side, you're going to see the tungsten begin to ball up on itself. And at even higher amperages, you're going to start to see the tip of your tungsten flutter. So this is basically going to be your threshold of where you know positive side of your balance is too much. So obviously when I'm TIG welding, I want to make sure I run enough heat input into the joint. Obviously, this ensures the best penetration. For the machines I use here in this shop, again, both of these are inverter type machines. I typically find somewhere around 20% on the positive side, 80% on the negative side. This is usually a ballpark that's going to work great. Again, if you want to experiment, you can try increasing and decreasing this, usually by about 2 to 5% per increment. Again, just little squeaks makes a big difference. And again, just practice on some scrap material. That's all you need. What you'll do after playing with that for a little bit is you're going to start to get familiar with the threshold on your machine, so you can really find that sweet spot right in between those two sides of where we want to be. Again, not too much negative side that we're starting to see dull and chalky looking results, but again, not too much on the positive side where we're starting to see instability with our tungsten. All right, so on the show, one of the most important things that we talk about all the time is cleanliness. And in doing so, how important it is to keep our work free from contamination. Now, to be completely honest, a lot of people assume that the subject of contamination totally going to be taken care of by cleaning their material as well as cleaning their filler material. But a lot of the time, the source of this contamination can come from our torch. And the main setting that can usually be the culprit behind this being a problem is called post flow. So the post flow setting on your machine, basically, it's a timer that will allow your gas to run for a set amount of time after you finish a weld. On most machines, this is typically measured in seconds, and this is absolutely something you need to pay close attention to. So when we are TIG welding aluminum, we don't need to post flow the aluminum TIG weld we have just finished. Aluminum reacts with our atmosphere completely differently than something like stainless steel or mild steel. Those types of metals need to be shielded by post flow quite a bit, but as I mentioned, we do not have to worry about this for aluminum. But it is extremely important that we still want to focus our post flow, because the main thing we need to keep covered with our post flow is our tungsten. Like we just talked about with balance, we always want to keep the tungsten completely in perfect shape. We need to keep it clean as well. This is the number one thing that's going to help you do that. All right, so anytime you finish a pass, we can always see the tungsten glowing red hot. Now, when it's glowing red hot, this is a state where it can form an oxide and form contamination by reacting with our atmosphere. That's right, the clean air that we breathe is going to mess that thing up. So if our post-flow cycle is cut short and our poor little tungsten is still in that vulnerable state, it is going to form an oxide on it. Anytime you look at your tungsten and it's looking chalky, it does not look reflective or anything like that, this is contamination. When we finish, we want to see a tungsten that is shiny and reflective. Usually a little bit of color is okay, but we want it reflective. We do not want any dull or chalky finish on it. Like I said, when it is not reflective, it has been contaminated. So when we get set up to do our next weld, what's gonna happen at the start when we arc up? Bam! All of this contamination is now going to be blown into the start of your next weld. Anytime we finish a pass, we have to keep our tungsten completely shielded by post flow. And using the timer to set this cycle on our machine is going to help us do this so we can keep that tungsten clean. Typically, I like having my post flow cycle run usually an extra second or so after my tungsten is finished glowing red hot. And yes, I pay for my own gas. So if the gas flow is cut short in this brief little window, there's absolutely no way around it. Contamination forms immediately. Anytime if you are unsure that you have enough post flow running, set your machine for an extra couple seconds just to be safe. After each pass, you can really time this for yourself. You can cut it back by about a half a second at a time. And then obviously we work our way back to the threshold roughly of where we want to be. One common mistake that I see a lot of people making without even knowing it, even if they have a perfect amount of post flow set on the timer on their machine, when they finish welding, they do this. You see that? You see how the torch was pulled away from the welding area right after the weld is finished. So even though we have a great amount of time set on our timer, we have good gas coming out of the torch. When you move your torch aside like this, you remove it from the gas envelope and you compromise the consistency of your gas flow severely. So to be honest, when I'm filming and I'm watching footage of myself welding, I actually realize I do this pretty often, but I am trying to improve at it. But obviously, like I said, when we do this, our gas flow is going to be interrupted or become inconsistent. And again, that oxide is going to form on our tungsten. Try and keep your torch somewhat stable after you finish a weld. If we have the perfect amount of gas for the perfect amount of time coming out of the torch, you should finish your pass and see your tungsten looking nice and shiny. Now, we just went over 3 of the most important settings and a way that you can troubleshoot your way through some of these exercises to find what works best for your machine. Like I said, every machine is a little bit different. So now we have our gear set up properly. Right? Now we need to go over 3 of the most important things that you need to do when you're getting going with TIG welding exercises so that we can make sure you avoid these bad habits. This episode here goes over those 3 things. This is going to help you shorten the learning curve a little bit so you can start getting some really good looking stuff much sooner. Do a random act of kindness for a stranger today. My name is Dusty. Bill and Chill. We will talk soon. Peace.